a diversity photo has never helped a leader of color thrive and flourish. But space to do ministry, different theological models that honor people's backgrounds, the appropriate funding given to ministers and other professionals of color, those things start to provide tangible helps. And the organization doesn't need to advertise that they're doing it. They just need to do it.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore how religion is lived. I'm your host, Rachel Schneider, a religion scholar and director of the Religion and Public Life Center at Rice University. Today, we're going to be talking about religion, race, and remaking our world and organizations into spaces of equity. Our guest is Oneya Fennell Okuwobi, a sociologist at the University of Cincinnati and author of a new book published by the University of California Press called Who Pays for Diversity? Why Programs Fail at Racial Equity and What to Do About It. It is a brilliant and sobering study of how diverse organizations like universities, corporations, and churches affect racial inequality in the lives of people of color within them. And in addition to being a professor and sociologist, Oneya has experience working in both the corporate world and as a consultant with churches around racial equity. So she is an expert and leader in multiple contexts. And I'm so glad that she can be here with us today on Religion Unmuted to share more about her work and her insights. So thank you so much for joining us, Oneya.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me just start by saying that a lot of your academic work has focused on race and inequality in multiracial or multi-ethnic churches. So maybe a place that we can start and you can share more with our listeners about is how you came to study race and religion and why you focused on the multiracial church space in particular.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a winding one. I currently live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and when I first moved to Cincinnati, I began attending a church there, which was the very first church I'd ever been to, focused on issues of racial reconciliation. And so being the person interested in research that I was even before I became a professor, I wanted to know more about this. And so I became a person who was studying dynamics of race in the church and in order to help teach churches and congregants of how to better live together, how to reconcile with each other. But about 10 years into that work, I started to understand the ways in which it wasn't working. So the fact that we were together in these church spaces, there were lots of unintended hurts that were going on and mostly absorbed by folks of color. And by that point in my work, I had started going to conferences and other spaces that were designed to teach people, hey, the way forward is to become these multiracial churches, and this is how we do it. And at those conferences and meetings, people were coming up to me and saying, hey, I want to tell you my story. I want to tell you about the experiences I'm having in my church about not being heard or feeling like I was just brought in to have a black face or a brown face or what do you think about this? And so understanding that what started off with very good intentions was not producing fruit for both white folks and for folks of color, I really wanted to investigate that and figure out what were the processes behind why that was happening.
Yeah, and I want to get back to something that you said just really briefly in the beginning of your answer, which was racial reconciliation. So tell us a little bit more about what that word means for people, especially for maybe people who haven't been part of Christian churches. What is racial reconciliation, and how has it come to be understood in contemporary American Christianity?
Yeah. So reconciliation has been used as a term as people have searched for ways to talk about race in the church that felt consistent with Scripture. And there's this scripture about humanity being reconciled to God. And so people using that to talk about people being reconciled to each other. And so it became a very popular term to be used. But in more recent years, and probably all along, it's been increasingly problematized. Because the idea of reconciliation means that you were reconciled in the first place, that you are returning to a situation. And if you talk about humanity being reconciled to each other, there's a question to say, since the creation of racial groups have never been reconciled to each other. So there's no going back to a thing that has not happened, but there is a belief that that can still be created. But we need to talk about it rightly. We need to understand that there is not an ideal that we have to go back to, that thing needs to be created. And so in more recent years, the better terms to use have been terms like racial justice. Again, there's a scriptural basis for that, but there's also a sociological basis to look at justice. And so it becomes a more encompassing term to think about what are we really aiming to do.
Right. So along with racial justice, the term that you have really focused on in your work, in addition to racial equity, of course, is diversity. So one of the things that you really talk about is how this diversity paradigm, the idea that our organizations should be racially and ethnically diverse, has taken hold in corporations, in higher education, but also in churches. And though we're seeing some pushback now to that idea, what is it that you're hoping readers will take away when they consider the ideal of diversity? Because you talk about the hidden costs of diversity, why diversity and the push for diversity, ironically or sadly, can actually do more harm than good, particularly for leaders of color who are tasked often with representing racial progress. But they're also tasked with the demands of enacting diversity initiatives and things that will help places look good in terms of diversity. So say more, I guess, about diversity and what it means in the context of your study.
Yeah. So the hard thing is diversity has been, at least until recently, and we viewed with a lot of positivity by the general public. There are a lot of people who say we want to be in diverse environments, and it has become a way by promoting fair representation, promoting having everyone together to give a picture of there being equitable racial relationships. So that becomes the aim. And so it's a solution to a problem. People know that there's a problem. There's racial inequality, and diversity says, well, if we can just have environments where everyone can come in, where everyone can be represented, then we have solved the problem. Too often, though, that focuses the attention on just that, saying that this representation then means that we have solved the problem, means that there are equitable relationships between people, that everyone has what they need to succeed, that everyone feels equally welcome to be in a space. And that has not been the case. And so there's a lot of energy that has been invested in just having people in spaces. But the question that I ask when it comes to diversity is, are you benefiting the people who are coming into the space, or are you benefiting the organization itself that can then say, look at the variety of people we have here?
Right. I know. And the way I think about it often is, are we actually creating conditions that allow the people who have been most impacted by injustice to actually thrive in our organizations? And if not, then what does it mean when we talk about the work of making our organizations more diverse? And one of the things I think that you do really compellingly in your book is you talk about just the incredible gifts that employees of color offer. And you talk about clergy of color specifically as one of the groups you look at, and the gifts that they've offered to their organizations, to the people around them, often in unpaid and unrecognized ways. And part of the reason that they pour into this work, like mentoring and serving, is because of their commitment to serving a greater good and trying to create a better world for marginalized groups and the future generations. And you call that diversity as philanthropy. So how have you seen that idea, diversity as philanthropy, playing out in religious contexts specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So diversity as philanthropy is when employees of color, and including clergy, give self-sacrificially of their time and their resources in an employment situation in order to help constituencies of color. So this is a person who is assigned to do one sort of job, but they take on themselves additional job responsibilities in ways that becomes philanthropy because they're actually in a lot of cases, putting their own advancement at risk. And this is almost something that we expect from people of color in organizations, sort of uncritically. We're just like, you're here. Of course, you're going to do all of this additional work. But to think about it, it's really quite remarkable that you would be in a job, receiving a paycheck that you need to feed your family, and you would put that at risk so that somebody else in that organization, so that another person of color in that organization can thrive and succeed. And I think about, one of the pastors I talked to, he's a Asian American pastor out in the Pacific Northwest, and created, again, not part of his job description at all, created an entire multiracial, multicultural fellowship so that people who did not feel like they had a space anyplace else in the church had a space. Over 300 people attending this in a church of 1,800 people. And so he's not been given any resources. It's not part of his job description, but yet every week this group is meeting and eating together, and people who don't have voice in the other parts of the church are having voice. But at the same time, he's saying, I'm doing this beautiful thing. He's like, and I'm worn out, and nobody is resourcing the work that I'm doing. And I show up week after week to do it. And when opportunities for advancement came for him to apply for the senior pastor position of the entire church, they don't give it to him. They give it to a white man who is well known for his writings on diversity, not the person in their midst who's already doing the thing that allows them to be a diverse church.
Yeah, something that I've really grappled with while reading your book is even for people who are not in churches, but who maybe came from a religious background, how much does that impact the willingness to sacrifice yourself, sometimes in ways that are really detrimental to you or even further advancement? Is that something that you observed in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were several rationale that I named for diversity as philanthropy. And one of the main ones was religious rationale. So I had a Black professor who talked to me about being in a new city, as new professors often are. But after over a year of being there, he had nothing on the walls of his apartment. He had done no decorating. And why? Because without this being rewarded by his position, night after night, he was in the library until midnight, just looking for students of color and Black students in particular to say, well, I'm a professor. I'm here. Do you need something? Can I help you? When he talked about why he did that, he said, from his upbringing in Black Pentecostalism, he learned that the purpose of his life was to give his life away. And again, that is a laudable and a fine goal. But doing that in a context of an organization like a university that not only doesn't reward you for it, but punishes you for it if it comes at the expense of the things that they think are important, like publications, is a mechanism that helps perpetuate racial inequality. We would need to have organizations that would reward this sort of behavior and not try to keep employees of color from doing this sort of behavior, because they're going to do it anyway, right, as been shown time and time again. It's not that they don't know better. It's not that they know it's not going to benefit them. They are philanthropists, and they're going to do it anyway.
Wow. Yeah, that desire is so powerful, and your book was incredibly sobering to read in that regard, and all the ways that you just really detailed the experiences of people of color and the real toll and cost that being in an organization that outwardly, is expressing a desire to be more diverse, a commitment to diversity, but yet is exacting all of these taxes, psychic taxes, emotional taxes, material taxes on their employees of color.
Yeah. There's something so painful about the wounds of a friend. Yeah. It's one thing to be in an organization that is actively discriminatory, because you kind of know how to suit up for that. You know how to show up in that space. People of color generally, and Black folks in particular, have been doing that for a long time. But when you get to a place that says, we want to be diverse, we want you, we're recruiting you specifically, and not just because of that, but because we want to make sure that we have all of the voices at the table, your qualifications and your lived experience. We want those things to come together. And you get into that space with those dreams, with those hopes, and then time and time and time and time again, your voice is silenced. That was much harder for the people that I talked to than being in those spaces that they knew were going to be openly antagonistic to them. And you mentioned the harm done. It was a surprise even to me. And I've lived a lot of this and I've seen a lot of it, but it was a surprise even to me when I didn't recruit for people who were suffering or struggling in some way, that 9 out of 10 of the pastors I talked to were experiencing physical or emotional signs of stress that they attributed to being in these environments where there was that mismatch between what they were promised and what was being delivered.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the conversations that have been happening around this term, betrayal trauma. It's the kind of trauma that emerges when you feel betrayed by institutions that you trust or have hoped that you can trust. And I think that trauma is real. And just as we've been talking about the layers in all of that, and it can be particularly heightened in a church context. It's so rooted, too, in these deep ideals that we should be a beloved community, In the church context, it's this sense of we should be something higher and we'll sacrifice in order to live out our highest ideals. So when that doesn't happen, I can imagine it's been particularly tragic for pastors.
Mm-hmm. 100%. One of the first things that happens, especially if you are a pastor at a church, is just like, oh, we're family. We're together in this thing. And it turns out you're not quite the part of the family that you thought you were. You're the part of the family that eats in the kitchen, perhaps. But also, being a pastor, being a member of the clergy is such a whole life vocation. So it's not as though you go to work and you come home. You go to work and you're talking with people in your congregation day by day, and you're experiencing maybe some of those microaggressions. And then your family is fellowshipping at that church. So if you're experiencing pain, you come home and you're talking to your spouse, but your spouse has relationships with all of these same people, and you're talking to your kids and they're going to, programming at the same place. So your entire life is tied up in a place where you had such high hopes. And then those hopes end up not being realized and your personhood ends up not being respected. And then there's really no place to get away from it.
So I guess that leads to something else I wanted to ask you about. I mean, if we're not doing diversity, if we're really rejecting the diversity paradigm for all the ways that you've talked about, and we're looking for a better way forward for our organizations that can truly create spaces that support equity and support leaders of color, what do you think are some more generative ways forward that don't exact some of the same tolls that we've been talking about?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say, and I will get to Black leaders in a second, but the organizations who are well-meaning and want to do the right sorts of things, focusing on listening to their leaders of color and then putting in place things that will help them. Yeah. A diversity photo has never helped a leader of color thrive and flourish. But space to do ministry, different theological models that honor people's backgrounds, the appropriate funding given to ministers and other professionals of color, those things start to provide tangible helps. And the organization doesn't need to advertise that they're doing it. They just need to do it. But there is that flip side of what do leaders of color need to do. And I know for me personally, one of the things that has become increasingly true the longer I am a scholar and the longer I do this research is I do not sit at tables where what I need is not being served. It can be, and I do write about this, such a trap to be in the quote unquote diverse majority white organization that is seen as higher status, where I can get the higher paycheck, where I can get recognition for being there. But if it's harming my well-being, if it's harming my health, if it's harming my ultimate opportunities for advancement, if it's harming my family, I don't need to be there. And so what does it mean to be really selective about what organizations we join ourselves to, how we allow ourselves to be used for these organizations, and what does it mean to continue to cultivate majority-minority organizations alongside of that, so that there is this circulation and there's this feeling of, I don't have to subject myself to this because I have alternatives. That does take sacrifice, and we recognize the inequalities and the reason why that's difficult. But if we never begin to do it, if we continue to subject ourselves to this with the hope that a better place will be created for us, I don't think we'll ever get there.
And just for those who might not know, what is a majority-minority organization?
Yes. Yeah. So it would be an organization that is led by people of color, and even more so than that, it is designed around non-majority ways of working and ways of doing things. So we talk a lot about white normativity, where white ways of working and professionalization are normalized and said that this is just the way organizations work. But it's not the only way. There are alternatives. So a majority-minority organization would have that freedom to draw from other ways of working and to put those forward. So it's not just having a person of color at the head, but it's a very different way of engaging with each other. HBCUs are the classic example of how that happens. And if you look even at the mission and vision statements of HBCUs, at least some of them have a much more expansive vision of what does human flourishing look like. You know, it's not just a statement that says we're devoted to diversity, but it's a statement that says we are devoted to social justice and transformation of society. And so when you have a different voice coming to bear in how the organization is going to work, it really can look different. And so continuing to cultivate those spaces where people are not adjusting themselves to white normativity would be the ideal.
Yeah, I really appreciate how your work shows us why the world we have and what we're settling for is not enough. It's not nearly enough. And it is helping us dream towards the future. So what would you say you hope that people will ultimately take away from your book?
Yeah, I hope that people take away the ways that compromises, half measures, such as a focus on diversity, can end up doing more harm than good. And so if we are saying we're doing diversity because ultimately we want racial equity, we want everybody to have what they need to succeed, then let's just do that. Just do the thing that is the whole thing, even if it's difficult, even if it's politically challenged. And again, speaking to this current moment, we are in a moment where diversity and DEI broadly has been maligned. People of color have been called DEI hires in very public ways, from mayors to university presidents. And so the response from people has been to fight to keep the status quo and to keep what we have. But what we have has not been effective for people of color either, in the ways that I detail, in the ways that others have detailed. I mean, most scholars would get to the point of saying, you know, this perhaps does nothing. And I'm saying this actually does harm. If we're going to fight for something, let's fight for the thing that we really want. There is the folks who are opposing DEI in all of its forms. They're not fighting for a compromise. They're fighting for the thing that they really want, and they believe it's possible. And guess what? It's beginning to happen. So if we're going to fight back, let's know the terms of engagement, and let's understand what it will really take for all people to flourish in our organizations, which will make our, for all the reasons we talk about, which will make our organizations better, which will make us better, but more importantly, is just the right thing to do.
Right. Absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with churches, because churches don't really have the same pressures, if you will, that many corporations and universities have to show diversity in certain kinds of ways. But they do have pressures in terms of the pressure of ideals. They're spaces where people come together voluntarily, and they're voluntarily trying to create a community that they hope will speak to a higher vision of the way things should be here on earth. So what are your hopes for churches specifically? What do you think could happen maybe in church spaces that couldn't happen in other spaces if people really move towards an equity model?
Churches are uniquely equipped to invite people to be sacrificial. There's enough dedication and enough critical mass that the messages that come forward from churches could really change things in the lives of people who then go out into universities, who then go out into workplace, who could do something different. And so what I would hope is that churches are maybe least active, but most equipped to be able to disentangle themselves from the idea that I'm not going to say certain things, or I'm not going to speak out for justice for the sake that it might be a monetary hit, or it might lead me to be quote unquote less successful, because there is an idea, at least among some people, that success and monetary, in terms of numbers or monetary success, is not what churches are for. That churches are for telling the truth and moving us towards a vision of justice and righteousness. And so the hope is that if those spaces could catch a vision for this, and if the places that have in a well-meaning way at least begun to engage with race, continue to engage with race, that they can go further faster than their corporate siblings or their university siblings. But it's a matter of willingness. They have to be willing to take on those sacrifices. But I would guess we have some pretty good examples of sacrifice as a church that might lead us to do that.
Yeah, totally. And I know we've been talking about churches, Christian churches specifically, because that's what your research focused on. But religious organizations broadly, I just think that there are so many rich religious traditions and spaces where people really do have a commitment to healing the world, human dignity, and can really gather around an ethic of shared commitment and sacrifice. So I'm really hopeful amidst these times that we can find a way forward. And, as we get to the close of this episode, when you think about your own work in life and everything we've talked about, all the things we could talk about, is there anything final you want to share with our listeners?
I want to hit again on this idea of imagination. I feel like that is something that has been taken away from us in some ways. Don't get your hopes up too high. Be realistic. Think about what's really possible and just do that. And it again leads us to these half measures, thinking, okay, well, I can't do it all. So I can do this, I can take this step, and hopefully the next generation will take the next step. But if we were to activate our imaginations and really think about what an equitable world would look like, and then the small step is not taking wherever we are and going halfway towards that. It's maybe taking a very tiny part of where we are, one role, one job, one organization, one family, even one neighborhood, and going all the way towards that ideal and that imagination. When that happens, instead of crude dispersing half measures, as I believe diversity has been, you start to create models of full measures that can then be scaled up, and other people can catch that imagination of, wow.
It's such a challenge to me personally as I think about all the spheres in my own life. And I haven't heard anyone break it down quite in that way and say, pick a small portion, some piece of this larger work, and then go all the way. So that is really lovely.
When everybody has what they need to succeed, everybody, this is so much better. And I don't have to worry about who has what slice of the pie, because we all get a full pie.
Thank you so much for being here on Religion Unmuted.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you listen. And my special thanks to our guest, Oneya Fennell Okuwobi. Today's show was written by myself, Elaine Howard Eklund, and Haley Hemstreet. Our series was produced by Three Wire Creative. Religion Unmuted is a joint venture of the Bonick Institute and the Religion and Public Life Center at Rice University. And I'm Rachel Schneider. Until next time.